Lesson 3 of History for Class 6, that is, in the earliest cities. If you remember, in the previous lesson, we read about the early people and learnt how those people who were once hunter-gatherers slowly became farmers and herders. They started leading a settled life. Gradually, villages came into being and later cities developed. In today's lesson, we shall talk about some of the earliest cities. Now, what kind of cities were those? How were they different from today's cities? We shall talk all about that. But before we start, let's take up this little question that these two boys, Harpreet and Jaspal, playing cricket outside their home. They noticed some people admiring the old building that the children called the haunted house. They were admiring the building's architecture and the fine wood carving, and were also talking about repairing and preserving the house. Now the children wonder, why would anyone be interested in an old house, that too in such a bad shape? Usually, such buildings are pulled down to make way for new construction. Children, I'm sure many of you too might be thinking, what was the need to preserve that old building? So, here's your answer. Very often, old buildings have a story to tell. They tell us about the people who once lived in them. In today's lesson 2, we shall come across one such story, the story of a lost civilization, the story of Harappa. This story began and Samvita was a colony of the British. Railways had been introduced in India and the railway lines were being laid down everywhere. The engineers in Punjab by chance came across the site of Harappa, which is in present-day Pakistan. What they found was a mound of destroyed bricks. They carried off thousands of bricks from the walls of the old buildings of the city to build railway lines. Archaeologists found the site and realized that this was one of the oldest cities in the subcontinent. As Harappa was the first city to be discovered, all other sites from where similar buildings were found were described as Harappan. These cities developed about 4,700 years ago, and since these cities developed and flourished in the Indus River Valley, it is also known as Indus Valley Civilization. These cities were found in Punjab and Sindh in Pakistan, in Gujarat, Rajasthan, Haryana and Punjab in India. Archaeologists have found a set of unique objects in almost all these cities. These objects include red pottery painted with designs in black, stone weights, seals, special beads, copper tools and parallel-sided long stone blades. Now let's talk about what was special about these cities. Many of these cities were divided into 2 or more parts. Usually, the part to the west was smaller but higher. Archaeologists describe this as citadel. Generally, The part to the east was larger but lower. This is called the lower town. Very often, walls of baked bricks were built around each part. The bricks were so well baked that they have lasted for thousands of years. The bricks were laid in an interlocking pattern, and that made the walls strong. In some cities, special buildings were constructed on the citadel. For example, in Mohenjo-daro, a very special tank, which is called the Great Bath, was built in this area. This was lined with bricks, coated with plaster, and made watertight with a layer of natural tar. There were steps leading down to it from two sides, while there were rooms on all sides. Water was probably brought in from a well and drained out after use. Perhaps important people took a dip in this tank on special occasions. Other cities such as Kalibangan and where sacrifices may have been performed. And some cities like Mohenjo-daro, Harappa and Lothal had elaborate storehouses where they stored grains and other things. Now let's move further and talk about houses, drains and streets in the Harappan cities. Generally, houses were either 1 or 2 stories high, with rooms built around a courtyard. Most houses had a separate bathing area and some had wells to supply water. Many of these cities had covered drains. These were carefully laid out in straight lines. Although you cannot see it, each drain had a gentle slope so that water could flow through it. Very often, drains in houses and smaller drains led into bigger ones. As the drains were covered, inspection holes were provided at intervals to clean them. All three, houses, drains and streets, were probably planned and built at the same time. So children, did you notice that even about 4,700 years ago, the towns were planned? Impressive, isn't it? Now let's talk about the kind of life people lived in such cities. A Harappan city was a very busy place. There were people who planned the construction of special buildings in the city. These were probably the rulers. It is likely that the rulers sent people to distant lands to get metal, precious stones and other things that they wanted. They may have kept the most valuable objects such as ornaments of gold and silver or beautiful beads for themselves. And there were scribes, people who knew how to write, who helped prepare the seals and perhaps wrote on other materials that have not survived. Look at this picture. This is the picture of a Harappan seal. The signs on the top of the seal are part of a script. This is the earliest form of writing known in the subcontinent. Scholars have tried to read these signs, but we still do not know exactly what they mean. Thousands of such seals have been found from various Harappan sites. These seals may have been used to stamp bags or packets containing goods that were sent from one place to another. After a bag was closed or tied, a layer of wet clay was applied on the knot and the impression of the seal is known as a sealing. If the sealing was intact, one could be sure that the goods had arrived safely. Children, seals are used even today. Now you are used for. Coming back to people who lived in cities, besides scribes, there were craftspersons men and women who made all kinds of things, either in their shops. People were traveling to distant lands or returning with raw materials and perhaps stories. Many terracotta toys have been found and children must have played with these. So children, the people who lived in these cities mainly included rulers, scribes and craftspersons. Now, let us look at some of the objects that were made and found in Harappan cities. Most of the things that have been found by archaeologists are made of stone, shell and metal, including copper, bronze, gold and silver. Copper and bronze were used to make tools, weapons, ornaments and vessels. Gold and silver were used to make ornaments and vessels. Perhaps the most striking things or objects that have been found are beads, weights and blades. Children, look at this picture and just notice how carefully and precisely these weights are shaped. These were made of chert, a kind of stone. These were probably used to weigh precious stones or metals. Now look at these beads. Many of these were made out of carnelian, beautiful red stone. The stone was cut, shaped, polished and finally a hole was bored through the center so that a string could be passed through it. The Harappans also made seals out of stone. These are generally rectangular and usually have an animal carved on them. They also made pots with beautiful black designs. Now let's talk about cloth. Look at this stone statue, children. It is a statue of an important man found from Mohenjo-daro that shows him wearing an embroidered garment. Cotton was probably grown 1,000 years ago. Actual pieces of cloth were found attached to the lid of a silver vase and some copper objects at Mohenjo-daro. Archaeologists have also found spindle whorls made of terracotta and faience. These were used to spin thread. Faience is a material that is artificially produced, unlike stone or shell that are found naturally. A gum was used to shape sand or powdered quartz into an object. The objects were then glazed, resulting in a shiny glassy surface. The colors of the glaze were usually blue or sea green. Faience was used to make beads, bangles, earrings and tiny vessels. Many of the things that were produced were probably the work of specialists. A specialist is a person who is trained to do only one kind of work, for example, cutting stone or polishing beads or carving seals. Look at this statue again and see how well the face is carved and how carefully the beard is shown. This must have been the work of an expert craftsperson. Not everybody could have been a specialist. We do not know whether only men were specialists or only women were specialists. Now, let's move ahead and talk about the raw materials that were used by these craftspersons to make different objects. Raw materials are substances that are either found naturally, such as wood or ores of metals, or produced by farmers or herders. These are goods. For example, Cotton produced by farmers is a raw material that may be processed to make cloth. While some of the raw materials that Harappans used were available locally, many items such as copper, tin, gold, silver, and precious stones had to be brought from distant places. The Harappans probably got copper from present-day Rajasthan and even from Oman in West Asia. Tin, which was mixed with copper to produce bronze, may have been brought from present-day Afghanistan and Iran. Gold could have come all the way from present-day Karnataka and precious stones from present-day Gujarat, Iran and Afghanistan. Now, how were goods carried from one place to another? Look at these illustrations. One shows a toy and the other is a seal. These suggest that the Harappan people used carts, boats and ships to transport goods. Now let's move away from cities and talk about the countryside. While many people lived in the cities, others living in the countryside grew crops and reared animals. These farmers and herders supplied food to craftspersons, scribes and rulers in the cities. We know from remains of plants that the Harappans grew wheat, barley, pulses, peas, rice, sesame, linseed and mustard. A new tool, the plough, was used to dig the earth for turning the soil and planting seeds. While real ploughs, which were probably made of wood, have not survived, toy models have been found. As this region does not receive heavy rainfall, some form of irrigation may have been used. This means that water was stored and supplied to the fields when the plants were growing. The Harappans and buffalo, water and pastures were available around settlements. Large herds of animals were probably taken to greater distances in search of grass and water. They also collected fruits like bear, caught fish and hunted wild animals like the antelope. That was all about Harappan cities. Now we shall take a closer look at some important Harappan towns in Gujarat. Are we ready? First, we shall talk about the city of Dholavira, which was located on Khadir Bait in the run of Kutch, where there was fresh water and fertile soil. Unlike some of the other Harappan cities, which were divided into two parts, Dholavira was divided into three parts, and each part was surrounded with massive stone walls with entrances through gateways. There was also a large open area in the settlement where public ceremonies could be held. Other finds include large letters of the Harappan script that were carved out of white stone and perhaps inlaid in wood. This is a unique find, as generally Harappan writing has been found on small objects such as seals. Now let's talk about another city, the city of Lothal, that stood beside a tributary of the Sabarmati in Gujarat, close to the Gulf of Khambat. It was materials such as semi-precious stones were easily available. This was an important center for making objects out of stone, shell and metal. There was also a storehouse in the city. Many seals and sealings were found in this storehouse. A building that was found here was probably a workshop for making beads, pieces of stone, half-made beads, tools for bead making and finished beads have all been found here. A dockyard has also been found at Lothal. Look at this picture. This huge tank may have been ships came in from the sea and through the river channel. Goods were probably loaded and unloaded here. Now, how did this civilization decline or end? Children, this is a mystery. Around 3900 years ago, we find the beginning of a major change. People stopped living in many of the cities were no longer used. Raw materials brought from long distances became rare. In Mohenjo-daro, we find that garbage piled up on the streets, the drainage system broke down, and new, less impressive houses were built, even over the streets. Why did all this happen? Scholars suggest that the rivers dried up. Others suggest that there was deforestation. This could have happened because fuel was required for baking bricks and for smelting copper ores. Besides, grazing by sheep and goat may have destroyed the green cover. In some areas, there were floods. But none of these reasons can explain the end of all the cities. Flooding or a river drying up would have had an effect only in some areas. It appears as if the rulers lost control. In any case, the effects of the sites in Sindh and West Punjab, which is in present-day Pakistan, were abundant, while many people moved into newer east and the south. Then, new cities emerged about 1400 years later. We shall read about those cities in the coming chapters. Now, children, when Harappan civilization was flourishing in the Indus River Valley, even before that, another civilization had developed on the lands along the river Nile in Egypt, most part of which is a dry desert. Ago, kings ruled over Egypt. These kings sent armies to distant lands to get gold, silver, ivory, timber, and precious stones. They also built huge tombs known as pyramids. When they died and buried in these pyramids, these carefully preserved bodies are known as mummies. A large number of objects were also buried with them. These included food and drink, clothes, ornaments, utensils, musical instruments, animals. Sometimes even serving men and women were buried with the rulers. These are amongst the most elaborate burials known in the world history. That was all about this lesson, children. Now it's time to take up a few exercises related to the lesson. Are we ready? But before we do that, let's take a quick look at what we studied about the story of Harappa, special features of Harappan cities, houses, drains and streets, life in the city, crafts and raw materials, what people ate, Harappan towns in Gujarat, and finally we read about the mystery of the end. Now let's try to answer a few questions. First we have some multiple choice questions and you have to choose the correct option. The first question is, when did Harappan cities develop? And the options are about 4700 years ago, about 3700 years ago, about 2700 years ago, or about 1700 years ago. So the correct option is yes, about 4700 years ago. Now the next question, how many stories of houses were generally found in Harappan cities? The options are 1 or 2 stories, 2 to 3 stories, 4 to 5 stories, or multi-stories. And the correct option is 1 or 2 stories. Now the next question, where did the craft persons make things in the earliest cities? The options are in their own houses, in special workshops, both A and B, or none of these. And the correct option is both A and B. Let's move on to the next question. Which metal was most commonly used during that time? Options: gold and silver, copper, bronze, or all of the above. And the correct option is yes, all of the above. Now the fifth question, Great Bath has been found from, and the options are Mohenjo-daro, Lothal, Kalibangan, or Dholavira. And the correct option is yes, Mohenjo-daro. Now the last question, which country is Harappa located in? And the options are India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, or Nepal. And the correct option is yes, Pakistan. Let's move ahead and try to answer a few questions in 1 or 2 words. The first question is, what was the smaller but higher part of the Harappan cities called? And the answer is Citadel. Next question is, name a place where cotton was grown about 7000 years ago. And the answer is Mehergarh. Very good. Let's move on to the third question. Which Harappan city was divided into 3 parts? And the answer is Dholavira. The next question is, which material was used to shape sand or powdered quartz into an object? And the answer is glue. Now the next question, which city had a dockyard? And the answer to this question is Lothal. Very good. Now we have another exercise, match the columns. You have to match these raw materials with the places they got them from. First we have copper. Copper was brought from Rajasthan. Then we have gold. Gold was brought in from present-day Karnataka. Next we have tin, which was brought in from Afghanistan. Last we have precious stones, which were brought in from present-day Gujarat. So children, with this we come to the end of today's video. I'm sure you liked it and got to know a great deal about the Harappan cities, their special features, and also about the people who lived there. Wasn't it all interesting? That's all for now. I'll be back with some more interesting videos. Till then, stay healthy, stay happy.